Okay, so we're gonna get going. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I hope you're all well and healthy and hanging in there. Let's crack on with today's fantastic webinar. My name is Sergio Lara, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's iCoachKids Shares live webinar number 16. Thank you for making the time to join us. Today, we're going to explore life skills in youth sport with three good friends and leaders in this area. Professor Dan Gould, Dr. Carl Erickson, both of them at Michigan State University in the US, and Dr. Scott Pierce at Illinois State University. Before we get going, though, let me allow Gary, my colleague Gary, to take you through some of the basic family rules. Gary, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Just a reminder of some of the webinar rules, which we've been running over the course of this year. So please keep your camera off throughout the webinar, but please be sure to submit all of your questions either via the chat function on Zoom, or if you're watching live on YouTube, please comment there, and I will collect all those questions in and ask them of our presenters at the conclusion of their presentation. Remember, everybody's opinion is valuable. Everybody's here to learn. Please respect that of other people. And while you're with us today, please also be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, watching over our 120 videos. Sign up to one of our 3 e-learning courses via iCoachKids.eu, or read one of the blogs on our website. So make sure you visit, comment, like, and share from our social media. Back to you, Sergio.
Thanks, Gary. We are getting so professional at this. Really, really impressed. Okay, so today's topic is life skills in youth sport. Sport is consistently proposed as an environment where kids can develop attitudes, skills, and behaviors that are valuable beyond sport. The process of how young people transfer life skills from sport to other life domains has received a lot of attention in recent times. Our guests today have all conducted and published research in life skills development over the last 40 years. So it is fantastic that we have their expertise available to us today. I'm going to introduce all of them together and then let them get on with their presentation. First, Dr. Scott Pierce works for Illinois State University in the US, although he is originally from New Zealand. He completed his PhD at Michigan State with Dan and has since produced terrific research in this area with an emphasis on how psychological skills are developed to assist sport performance and how, why, and under what conditions life skills are developed in sport and transferred to other life domains. That's Scott. Then we've got Dr. Carl Erickson. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Michigan State University, also in the US, and his research focuses on the athlete development and coaching in youth sport, and in trying to understand youth sport as a context for personal development. He is interested in the integration of performance, health, and psychosocial outcomes, and how interpersonal processes associated with participation in sport influence these developmental outcomes. His work examines the influence of coach-athlete interactions, the learning and development of sport coaches, and the influence of different contexts in which youth sport takes place. So that's Carl. And last but not least, we have a professor, or we should just say the professor, Dan Gould. Dan is director of the Institute for the Study of Youth Sport at Michigan State University. In 2019, he was named the inaugural Gwendolyn Norrell Professor of Youth Sport and Student Athlete Wellbeing at Michigan State. It's a fantastic job title, really, if I may say. His area of expertise is mental training for athletic competition and sports psychology. His research interests include the stress-athletic performance relationship, psychological foundations of coaching, athlete motivation, youth leadership, and positive youth development through sport. I think it's fair to say that Dan literally wrote the book on sports psychology. He's been a consultant for the US Olympic Committee, the United States Tennis Association, and many numerous athletes and of all ages and skill levels. Please welcome on 3 speakers and over to them. Thank you guys for joining us today. How are you? Quick hello. Great, thanks for joining us. So, Scott, I'm going to hand over to you. I believe you're going to get us going.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Sergio.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to everyone. Really excited to be here today to join you with Dan and Carl, and really excited to have a chat about life skills and youth sport. So we're just going to go through a few of our ideas, share some research, and we're going to go back and forth between the 3 of us to kind of share what we're thinking about life skills in sport, but really open it up to questions and discussion. So to get us started, we really want to introduce to you to some general conceptions and definitions of life skills and our focus on life skills within a positive youth development or PYD framework. Now, positive youth development is a strengths-based conception of development in which children and adolescents are viewed as having resources to be developed rather than kind of thinking about it as being problems to be solved. So within the focus of PYD, we often operationalize life skills as those resources that can be developed. And here we're thinking about life skills as the interpersonal assets, characteristics, and skills, such as goal setting, emotional control, self-esteem, hard work, that can be facilitated and developed in sport and then transferred to non-sport settings. So within that definition, again, we're really thinking about both the process of developing and learning life skills through sport, through the sport context, but also how they're used, transferred, and applied to contexts and domains outside of sport. And when we think about life skills, it's easy to limit ourselves to not only to view life skills as just kind of those discrete cognitive or behavioral skills that an athlete takes from sport and then applies to other domains. I think we can also think about them in relation to some maybe greater developmental changes that youth experience. So for the sake of our conversation today, we're really going to broaden our definition of life skills a little and think about the development of knowledge, conceptual, procedural, tacit knowledge that can be developed through sport, as well as shifts in dispositions, mindsets, things like changes in behavioral or motivational orientations or changes in development, such as the challenge mindset related to resilience, and even more of a holistic identity construction or transformation. So we're going to take a bit more of a broad approach to defining life skills as a PYD outcome. So to help us fully understand the process of PYD and life skill development and transfer, Carl's going to share some general guiding frameworks to help us understand how we can use and promote life skills and transfer through sport.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And thanks to everyone, excuse me, to echo Scott, thanks for having us here and for joining us today. Really looking forward to the discussion as we get going. We've thrown up this crazy complicated diagram here. It's actually recently put together by Dr. Travis Dorsch and a number of other colleagues who work in this field. And we bring it up not that you have to memorize or that we're going to go through all parts of this, but just to highlight that while today we're mostly talking about sort of the coach's role in working with athletes to facilitate life skills development, neither the coach nor the athlete, when we do our work in these contexts, is in a bubble. We are all embedded within sort of these larger systems of influence, other people around that influence what we do and how kids respond to what we do. So one of the things we kind of wanted to keep in mind as we go through and as we get into more of our sort of more coach and kid focused work is that as coaches, we're never alone, right? So we need to sort of at least be aware of and at best work together with the other people, the other contexts, the other settings, organizations, et cetera, that are going to have an influence on the lives of the kids and the lessons that they learn through all the various experiences, which include, but are not limited to, the maybe hour or 2 hours that they're with us as coaches. We want to sort of keep in mind that we're embedded within a larger system as well, and that's also going to influence what kids get and the effectiveness of what we do in trying to facilitate life skills development. The only other thing I wanted to draw your attention to here is sort of, I don't know if you can see it, but at the bottom there's sort of a time arrow going across, and it has sort of like different stages of child development listed there. And I just wanted to sort of keep that in the back of our minds as we're going through what you might call thinking developmentally, right? Where a lot of the stuff we're going to talk through today, again, sort of very coach-centric, what coaches can actually do or think about to develop life skills in their young athletes. The principles are going to hold up when we're working with young people across different age groups, across different sort of stages of development. It just might look a little different. For example, a 5-year-old is not the same as a 9-year-old, is not the same as a 15-year-old, right? So the specific manifestations, the specific ways that we actually do the things that we're going to be talking about a little bit later might look a little bit different in practice. The sort of the nitty-gritty details might have to be adapted to the specific level of the kids that we're working with. One last sort of point in terms of this sort of thinking developmentally is not just adapting to the kid, but recognizing that whatever we do as coaches and working with young athletes, we're 1 point along their path towards hopefully happy and healthy lives, right? So we may not have to sort of fix everything, do all the stuff, teach all the lessons right now. Our job is to sort of just help them continue down along the path, set them up so that hopefully other people, other experiences can help contribute to that happy, healthy life. So again, I just wanted to sort of layer those in there again, as we talk more sort of coach-centric and kid-centric now, that this is embedded within the sort of that larger system and through time. All right, the next one.
Thanks, Cal. Yeah, so today we're going to really focus on 4 important considerations for coaching life skills. And as Cal pointed out, there's no perfect recipe for coaching life skills. There's obviously a lot of complex systems, but we're going to hopefully provide you with some kind of in-depth recommendations and ideas to help position you to best facilitate life skill development transfer. First, we're going to talk about how life skills are brought. So we'll talk about the need to recognize that youth bring a lot to the table to sport, and we need to individualize our coaching to them. Second, we're going to think about life skills being caught. We'll explore ways to structure the environment to support implicit life skill learning and transfer. Then we're going to think about life skills being taught. We'll discuss ways to explicitly coach and teach life skills. And then finally, life skills being bought will highlight the goal of having youth and kids buy into life skills learning and transfer.
In terms of life skills are brought, one of the things that we're finding in our research here at the Institute for the Study of Youth Sports is sometimes there's almost like an assumption when we're coaching that the kids come in as blank slates. Well, they don't. They come in with certain life skills already. So they don't enter youth sports as a blank slate. So that means it's very important for us to get to know our players and probably their parents. One study we just did shows that a lot of times in sport, we're reinforcing values that parents have emphasized to the kids at home, whether it's hard work or whether it's showing empathy to other kids, etc. Now, obviously, not all kids necessarily come from backgrounds where maybe the best skills or dispositions are emphasized. So we kind of want to get an assessment of that. So you might be thinking, what are my players' life skill strengths? What are their needs? And you may get this from thinking a little bit about the community. If I'm working in a real underserved area with a lot of kids coming from single family homes where the parent is just getting by and probably doesn't have the time to spend with that child, some of our research shows those kids will come in with more needs, maybe some more attentional difficulties. It'll be a little maybe harder to coach at first until you establish some routines. Versus I'm sort of reinforcing a lot of good patterns parents have always set up. Now, one way you might look at this to do is, just to do a quick assessment is ask your kids, what does it take to be a great athlete in this sport? What kind of things would they say? Would they talk about hard work? Would they talk about discipline? Would they talk about communication? You might add a few things for them, but that might give you an assessment of like where they're at. So let's go on to caught.
All right, thanks. So we wanted to sort of take a moment here before we get into sort of the more direct and intentional teaching strategies that Dan's going to talk about in a few minutes here. We wanted to think about the idea that life skills learning for kids doesn't start and stop just with our direct teaching. That may be sort of some of the most intensive and sort of emphatic ways of getting those messages through, but kids are always learning. There's sort of an old school saying in child development, kids are scientists, right? That's essentially the job of kids. They're continuously and constantly trying to figure out how the world works and what's their place in it, right? So they're paying attention to all sorts of stuff that's going on in every experience they have. So in those moments when we're, in between the times when we're maybe like directly teaching sort of very targeted or explicit life skills lessons, we can maybe think of what are the messages that the environments we're setting up around our athletes, in our teams, in our programs, in our organizations. What are the messages that are being sent there? And can we set up those environments so that even when we're not doing the explicit teaching, young athletes or young kids are having experiences, being put in situations, being rewarded for the development of life skills or attempts to work on their life skills. So you might think of sort of just going through, maybe even auditing, kind of, informally, mentally auditing our own programs, teams, environments, et cetera, to say what's being rewarded here, right? What opportunities are being provided? What messages are being sent about what's valued? Do we encourage creativity and risk taking? Are there opportunities for athletes to have some ownership and leadership in these environments? What are the peer dynamics like? Because a lot of the research shows that those little things can add up to sort of the messages that athletes take, right? And it's going to happen anyway, right? And if we're not intentional, it can potentially go the other way, right? So what we're saying here with life skills being caught is we're not getting into sort of the old trope of, sports are magic, and just the fact that there's a basketball or whatever here automatically leads to life skill development, but just that we can engineer the entire environment so that things are happening sort of even outside of our direct attention, and trying to figure out, well, if the stuff that we're going to do anyway, right? Like we're going to set up drills and activities, we're going to offer some instruction and feedback, right? We're going to, try and create a particular culture here. We're going to offer praise for certain things, right? Can we just say, well, if we're going to do it anyway, is there a way to just tweak it slightly, right? So that some opportunities for life skill development, so that life skill progress and learning is rewarded. So there are chances for athletes to, work with their teammates to solve some problems by themselves without the coach stepping in and just spoon feeding everything to them, right? So which sort of leads to the second point, the idea of, especially in these sort of more implicit environmental ways, a little actions can go a long way, right? It's not necessarily like ripping down all your coaching stuff, right? And totally reinventing it in new ways, or, adding hours of extra stuff that you're trying to figure out how to get in, right? It can be like tweaking, are there opportunities to tweak the things that we're already going to do anyway in ways that might just slightly more strongly prioritize and emphasize life skill development? For example, Scott and I recently conducted a study on leadership development in high school sports here in the US, right? And what we found is, well, yes, some direct teaching from the coach helped and worked and really supported leadership development, even just opportunities to be in leadership roles, to try things and have them not work sometimes and be supported in working through that, right? Sort of in a natural progression from in the 4 years of high school here in the US, freshman, sophomore, junior to senior, that the sort of natural progression allowed athletes to take on gradually more and more responsibility and really work their own way through, with coaches just sort of allowing it or encouraging it, right? So there are things that we can do. And part of that goes with the notion of how we talk matters, right? So the way that we interact with our athletes. Again, if we are at some point going to interact with our athletes, right, it's impossible to avoid. So can we make sure that the ways that we interact either sort of, again, directly support life skills development, or at least don't go in the other direction? A recent study we conducted a few years ago now tracked sort of some young athletes over the course of the season, a bunch of developmental outcomes. We were looking at sort of their change over the season in relation to the way that coaches interact with them. We tracked a whole bunch of crazy stuff, looking at instruction and feedback styles, all sorts of stuff. And the single biggest predictor of positive development of life skills learning over the course of the season for these athletes was the degree to which coaches talk to them about non-sport stuff. So asking them about life stuff, school, family, homework, etc. Athletes who got more of that experienced more positive development, right? So those little things matter, and often it's the way that we interact with our athletes, the way we develop real relationships and set up environments for those relationships that reward life skills learning, that provide opportunities for athletes to experiment and try life skills, and I can sort of nudge them in a direction as a complement to perhaps the more direct teaching of life skills that Dan is going to talk about now.
So as you see here, I have this quote: life skills are best taught versus caught. This doesn't go against what Carl just said. If we look at, we did a large review of all the studies here in the US, and there's been one I know of in the UK. And when they look at kids in sport in general, kids learn more positive things from sport than they do negative. There's times they learn negative, but in general, sport's a pretty good thing for kids. But we know we load the dice in our favor or amplify the positive effects if we're very intentional. And that's where, we're going to get more bang for our buck, more values, more good dispositions coming from the kid if we're intentional in terms of teaching those. So if we look on the next slide, let's talk about some specific things that you can do as a coach. First is ties to your coaching philosophy. Prioritize and define the life skills you want to teach or coach. I mean, there's a ton of life skills: teamwork, leadership, discipline, being on time, communication. which of those do you think are most important for kids to learn? We know from studying coaches that are very good at teaching life skills or coaching life skills that they don't always prioritize the same life skills to the same degree. So like, what are you going to feature? What are you going to emphasize with your team? That may come from your own coaching philosophy. And as I said earlier in the presentation, it may come from sort of a needs assessment of what you think your kids need. So pick 2 or 3 things to focus on during the year, talk about with the kids, etc. This brings me to the second point. Talk to your athletes about the skill. Tell them why it's important to communicate well. Or if you talk about concentration or attention. First, most of these skills, if we say something like discipline, that's going to mean all sorts of things to different kids. So you might say a disciplined athlete is one that shows up for training on time. A disciplined athlete is one that doesn't lose emotional control when the other kid is playing a little dirty or when they get a bad call. So it's really important that you define the skill, but then talk to the kids about why it's important or ask them why. As Carl said, getting kids to discuss these things. Too often as coaches, we give lectures. Getting kids to talk about why communication is important on the pitch in football. And then later you might drop in, well, how is communication important with your family or in school? Third point I have on the slide is model the skill. If I'm a coach that emphasizes emotional control and I lose it on the sidelines on a regular basis, the kids are not going to learn that lesson very well. What they'll learn is when you're a kid, you have to be quiet. And when you're an adult, you can go crazy. That's not the lesson you're probably intending. So we have to be good models ourselves. In one recent study we did, if we can go back that slide, one recent study we did, we found, an athlete learned a lot about emotional control from observing her basketball coach. She knew he was upset, but then he didn't yell at the team. We also know peers, the peers, like if somebody bullies on the team, that's going to lead to problems. So we want good peers. And we want to point out like high status models, pro athletes that exhibit the kind of traits we want. Okay, if we go to the next slide. If possible, this isn't always easy, but if you can construct some practice situations to use the skill. A good example, we did a study of a wrestling coach, and he'd put the kids at an appropriate age, in hard physical training. These were high school age boys, 15, 16, real high physical training where fatigue came in. And then he'd talk about like the importance of concentration and effort and how they can't give up just because it's hard. So he put them in a situation where, that kind of focus and adherence was maximized and then reinforced and talked about it. As Carl mentioned earlier, look for teachable moments. If 2 kids get into a little altercation on the field and push or something, if you have a whistle, blow the whistle, bring the team in, talk about why it might have happened, how they might have handled it differently. And sometimes this isn't rocket science. I used to work with pair skaters. And if a lot of times they're there 8 hours a day working in close proximity, they might have different personalities and they start arguing. So if you felt frustrated, we just turn them to turn away from the other person and take a deep breath before they said something. Third point on this slide, we want to reinforce the skills. So if I see the kids doing, like if I see signs of good teamwork, I want to yell out what it was. I want to maybe in a post practice huddle say, hey, Jonathan did a great job distributing the ball today and being unselfish. And as Scott's going to talk about next, or in a few minutes, we'll talk about coaching for transfer. A lot of these life skills are really things that will help your team perform better and help the kid perform better in sport, but we're hoping they carry on to other venues. So life skills are best taught as well as caught.
Thanks, Dan. So finally, we just want to bring it back to kind of our youth-centered focus and really the emphasis that life skills are bought by the athletes, and the young athlete really is the driver of life skills development and transfer. As we think about our long-term potential impact as coaches, I really like a quote from a famous football coach here, Amos Alonso Stagg. He once said, "I won't know how good a job I did for 20 years. That's when I'll really see how my boys turned out." So that coach to us really indicates that as coaches, we can't really always control if the life skills lessons and skills are going to stick. However, with that, we can kind of put ourselves and put our kids in the best position to learn and transfer these life skills. First, we really want to facilitate buy-in by empowering youth. So ways we can do that, and kind of it's reflected in some of the examples that Dan and Carl brought up, is to promote reflection and awareness, conscious awareness of the life skills that are being learned and that can be transferred. So we can have debriefing sessions to explicitly discuss what life skills are learned, how they were learned, and then how they can be used and applied in other areas of life. We also really want to promote agency and autonomy, and really having the youth feel like they're in control and in charge of the skills that they're learning. So if you're coaching leadership, for example, as Carl talked about, we recently did a study on that. We found that those youth that felt empowered to make real decisions in their sport, so designing practices, planning team events, and then they were encouraged by the coaches, encouraged by others to take on leadership roles outside of sports, such as in school committees and in the community. They really felt like they were in charge and they had their own agency and autonomy over their leadership, and they were more likely to use it across different domains. And then finally, we want to instill confidence in learning and transfer. So really, to have youth buy into their life skills, coaches need to take interest beyond sport. So really have an understanding of what's going on in their lives in school and work and other areas. So then they can encourage, support, and really stay in contact to really drive home and help those life skills stick in other areas of life. And then with that, we know that life skill development and transfer doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not devoid of context and culture. So our point that we really want to think about is congruence. So congruence with messages can really help to seal the deal. By congruence, we're talking about the degree of similarity in philosophies, messages, and behaviors between youth athletes, parents, coaches, teachers, and also the degree of similarity between developmental contexts, so between home life, sport life, the classroom, and other activities. And as Dan mentioned, we recently did a study on a wrestling camp, intensive wrestling camp here in the US. Their mission was to teach a set of life skills, 7 life skills, such as hard work, discipline, responsibility, and accountability. And they were deliberately designed through the sport of wrestling, so aligned really nicely with the sport and the objectives and the goals of the sport. And what we found with that is that the messages really resonated with some of the athletes, some of the young athletes in the camp. Young male athletes, a lot of them white and in the rural Midwest of the United States, they found that these life skills really transferred to a lot of their work. So a lot of their physically demanding tasks, such as laboring jobs, farm work, any kind of physically demanding task. And it was interesting as we thought about it, not only were those life skills aligned with wrestling, aligned with their physically demanding tasks, but also kind of drove home those ideologies of the American dream, where opportunities are possible for everyone, and meritocracy, where if you work hard, success goes to those who earn it. So for these young athletes, congruence was kind of seen throughout their sport, throughout their messages they were getting at home from the coaches at the wrestling camp, and from the culture and the ideologies that they were kind of living with. So congruence is really important, but if you're thinking, okay, that all sounds great, it's not that easy, then you're right. Obviously, congruence, we can't always achieve that. So we can't always control the life skills messaging and priorities outside of sport. And we found that in the wrestling camp study. Some of the former athletes who went to the wrestling camp said, okay, these life skills were all great, they were good, but they didn't gel, or they didn't kind of mesh with the experiences I had outside of life, where maybe there were social barriers and things like wealth and social capital and opportunity that limited kind of this idea that that hard work always brings success. So for those examples, kind of a lack of congruence made it harder for the young athletes, for the athletes to buy into the life skills and really transfer them. So just again, a highlight of some of the challenges we have in coaching life skills and some of the realities. And Dan's going to expand on that a little bit just to wrap us up with this discussion.
Yeah, so sort of a reality check. Obviously, the three of us are devoting a significant part of our lives to helping coaches, helping you do your job of helping kids develop as people as well as good little athletes. But I think it's the reality check is why coaching life skills sometimes falls short. And the first thing I put down here is a lack of a coach buy-in. Studying coaches from all different sports, one of the things we found over the years is the coaches who prioritize 2 or 3 life skills and sort of emphasize those get better results than coaches who kind of do lip service to it or say the right thing, but then after a couple of losses, there's no emphasis on life skills. So my advice to you as a coach would be pick a few things you want to feature and then kind of focus on that and be consistent over time. And what I have in the brackets there, belief in the sport evangelist myth. One sociologist of sport talked about what gets in the way of teaching life skills is, and I've worked with coaches in all different sports, and they all say their sport is the best. And somehow if you play that sport, and I love all the sports, you're going to be a better person because you played it. And I think our research shows, yeah, you might get some caught effect, but you're going to get the big effects when it's taught. So don't go in thinking that somehow sport is magical and it makes better people. The environment, as Carl said, the coaches, the peers are what make better people through sport. And as was mentioned earlier, inconsistent messaging, you maximize your effects. If we go back to that diagram Carl covered, with all the different parts of the systems, the peers, the coaches, the school, the community, the more congruence, the more consistency you get between coaches and parents, parents and peers, the more likely you're going to get effects. So if the coach talked about the importance of concentration, and he or she talks to the parents about that, and the parents kind of emphasize that, and the parents and peers start doing it, you're kind of amplifying the effects, loading the dice in your favor. And finally, as a coach, say one thing, but sometimes we do others. And there's, all of us, we're far from perfect, and we all have bad days where we're frustrated. Things don't go well, and we might say something to a kid we didn't mean. So on those one-off days, we probably should come back and apologize and say we shouldn't have done it, if that was the case. And in general, try to catch ourselves. Like, I'm frustrated. I had a bad day. I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes before practice, even if we start a couple minutes late, to reboot, to kind of clear my head. So, I don't kind of give it to the kids. Scott and I are working on a study with another colleague right now where we've interviewed people who played sport 50 years ago. And one thing that's amazed me is, this is 50 some years since they played their sports as a 16, 15, 17-year-old. And yet they remember specific things coaches said. They remember specific lessons. And they also talked about one person who actually didn't play very much in basketball, but sat the bench, but felt he learned a lot about teamwork. He learned a lot about roles on a team. And when he went into the insurance industry across his career, he felt what he learned, even when he didn't play, from his coach about teamwork, about roles, helped him have more empathy for people on his teams and industry, and helped him move up the managerial ranks because he learned these teamwork skills. So 2 points there. One, what kids learn can transfer. And 2, little things we say that we may never remember. Actually, when we interviewed coaches, they never remembered saying certain things to athletes, but the athletes remembered them 50 years later. So let me stop there. And I think it's the point where we'll turn it back to the moderators for questions.
Thank you, all three of you, Dan, Cal, and Scott. That's a great tour of the topic of life skills, and I've got a million questions. I know we have some questions as well on from the audience. I'm gonna get going. This is a part of sport that is very close to my heart, both in terms of my practice as a coach, but also in terms of my research. And I've been an avid follower of all your work for the last, I remember when I did my master's in sports psychology in the early 2000s, Dan, all your papers were the bread and butter, really, that's and your books. So everything kind of started there. But what I wanted to say first and foremost is how how well you have evolved the idea and the concept over the last 20 years, and how you, for example, you mentioned today the inclusion of all the different layers of the context and the different stakeholders. It's not just down to the coach. Okay, coaches are not magicians; they can't just do it all. Okay, and I think that's really important that we realize that and accept that as coaches. But also this idea of the debate, the long-standing debate between taught versus caught. I love the way you put it today with the broad, caught, taught, and bought, and how this really moves the debate forward and really makes it much more practical for the coach. So thanks a million for that. As by way of a summary, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question, okay? Because obviously we in the audience, we will have coaches that perhaps have never thought about how do I develop life skills with athletes, and want to make a start in doing this. So is there a way to kind of reviewing everything you've said today, if you had to start tomorrow, where would you start? And I know Dan, you for example mentioned, well, focus on 2 and 3 things. So apart from focusing on just a small number of things, what else do you feel that a coach that is trying to do this for the first time should really pay attention to? A question to any of the 3 of you. So
I guess I'll start off. When I look across all the research and actually also, I kind of live in 2 worlds. I live in this research world, but I also learn from the coaches I have in clinics and get to interact with. Relationship. If you connect with a kid now, and there's different ways to do that, but the stronger the relationship the coach has with the young person or his or her team, the more likely what you stress, whether it's on the pitch or off the pitch or on the court or off the court, is going to stick. And we did one study many years ago, and we found one coach formed relationship because he looked like a Greek statue. He was tall and muscular, and the kids they were young boys, looked up to him. And another guy was a little small guy, kind of wiry, nerdy looking. But the kids knew they could come to him 24 hours a day. Total, and they both formed great relationships with kids. So the way you do it kind of ties to your personality and other kind of things. But the more you can connect with those kids in relationship, the more these life skills are going to connect. So that would be my first response. But I'm sure my colleagues.
Yeah, before we go to them, I mean, you made a point there about the fact that there isn't one single way to skin this cat, and that it's really important that you're authentic and that you be yourself, because children will tell you straight away when they feel you're being phony. They tell you like it is. So I think that's a really important point. Be yourself and don't try to imitate someone else, because that looks terrible. Okay.
Yeah, it's weird because there are some general principles, like in general in youth sports, people who are more positive versus always criticizing kids, that tends to do better. But it's got to be real, genuine, positive remarks and not like pats on the head that don't mean anything.
Yeah, great stuff. Carl, where are you going to go next?
Sure, I can. First off, I would just echo Dan. I think it's hard to get away from that one. That like real human relationships. I think it's really easy sometimes in sport to sort of like get overwhelmed by the sport aspect of it, and we've got to teach all this stuff, and this is somehow a separate from life thing. And I think we could go a long way by just remembering like this is a real human child, right? Like how would we interact with that child, if we're at a family gathering or on the street or whatever, right? So it's like that. Like as Dan mentioned, the importance of relationships and keeping sort of the human aspect of there, you're probably not going to go wrong, and you might actually do a lot right just by doing that. Just beyond that, I would say that this kind of echoes from what I talked about in the presentation. So I'm just kind of in that mindset now. Take the pressure off yourself to sort of like fix all the problems tomorrow. You know what I mean? Do all the good things tomorrow. Totally blow up everything you've done, and I would say look for opportunities in the way that you already do things to just try like tiny tweaks. Is there a way that I could just make this, just bring out, whatever the life skill or the lesson that we want to come from this? Is there a way to just nudge it a little bit in that direction? So sort of baby steps. And we're going to try, you'll figure out the stuff that works as you go and sort of like progressively, iteratively add stuff in rather than trying to sort of, burn it to the ground and build it all up again as this wonderful place of life skills. So yeah, take the pressure off. try little things in addition
Perfect.
to
So great, Carl. So we've got be yourself and baby steps, two great tools. Scott, I don't know if you've got anything to add at this level.
I'll just add a couple of things that add on that, and in relation to being yourself, I think a really good activity or exercise for coaches is just to identify, okay, what are my 5 core values? What really drive me as a person and as a coach? And then if we think about that, identify those, and then also think, okay, within my sport, what are some lessons that really connect? Okay, we've got a team sport of basketball. Teamwork is really important. Communication is really important. And for me, one of my core values is kind of collegiality, teamwork. So then really reinforcing those messages, and hopefully you don't need to go too far because it's part of who you are. And then as a coach, you can live those messages, they connect to your sport, so you can really continue to drive those home. And that's not a huge reach to say I need to go on this huge life skills curriculum. It's again just emphasizing who you are as a coach and connecting it to what makes athletes successful in your sport, and obviously that can make them successful as people as well.
A good little exercise to sometimes do is, got this from a famous coach in the US that was a professional player, is to think about how do your athletes see you as a coach. And if you think about like the most talented kid on the team, how would that kid say I coach? Then sort of an average kid, and then maybe the worst kid on the team, or the kid maybe you have the worst relationship, and just kind of take that exercise. How do they see you as a coach?
That's a terrifying experience, really, in terms of doing that self-reflection exercise, or even actually asking them to anonymously
really
tell you what.
Ask them that be the best.
Yeah, because and we do that sometimes, really, and you're always thinking, oh God, what's going to come back from this? Are they going to tell me that I'm just terrible and I'm a horrible person, or are they going to be happy with the way we do things? But it is super important to understand, well, to see your blind spots, really, because we all think we are wonderful, but we have terrible blind spots, really. Great. I mean, there was something that Scott said that probably takes us to the next question, really, around the idea of, and it's always been something that has been bugging me in my head, really, around, okay, so the impact on the development of life skills for 2 different children, one that is a recreational athlete that trains 1 hour a week, and another that trains 20 hours a week because he's already on the performance pathway. I mean, what do you know from your research around the different impact on these different types of children in different environments?
maybe just not a full answer to that question, but just some consideration to maybe get us rolling here. I'd say sort of a full understanding of each of those contexts and sort of the pluses and minuses that come with each of those, right? Like, so in the, say, the more recreational context, right, you maybe have sort of time or capacity within the amount of participation that is there, if you're not subject to sort of the competitive pressure, performance pressures, to really work on some stuff. And that can be a huge opportunity to really work some of the life skill stuff in. You're often then limited to sort of a dosage effect, right? If it's a once a week for an hour kind of thing. We also need to probably be realistic about the effect we can have. Hopefully we can layer into the larger system and capitalize on some synergies and congruence, as Scott mentioned. But it's going to be challenging. Whereas in the competitive environment, right, like we've got more time, you can really sort of intensively work on things, and you're going to have sort of emotionally hot experiences that are going to allow, as Dan mentioned, those chances to practice those things and reinforce them. But you've also then got the competing pressures that may or may not always align with the life skills. So the pressure to win and perform and move on. So I think again, this isn't really an answer to your question, but to start by being realistic about what the pressures and opportunities are in each, and then not trying to force the model of the other onto the one and saying, this is the situation that I'm working with. How can I leverage?
That's important. That reality check is important, because there'll be coaches on the call that train an hour a week and coaches that are training 20 hours a week. And what they can both do is different because of just the amount of time they spend with the kids. And you can say the relevance of the context to the kids' life and the importance they attach to the experience is yeah. And I'm going to ask you one last question that is kind of a step forward in terms of the last question that I asked. And this question came before the webinar on an email from one of the listeners. And then I'm going to hand over to Gary to continue to bring more questions in from the audience. But again, in your experience, just working with coaches or doing your research, Do you see any differences between the life skills that can be developed through team sports to individual sports to perhaps even adventure or extreme sports? Any differences there?
I guess, yeah, I'll start. I think, again, I think the life skills that are learned can really be and should be kind of really aligned with the objectives and the goals of the sport. So I think as coaches, if we can kind of think about the skills and messages that our sports send, then we can reinforce those. I know, I think as coaches, we also need to think beyond, again, those behavioral skills and maybe some of the mindsets or dispositions that can be developed through sport. So again, maybe changes in motivational orientation and kind of just the process of learning skills and kind of going through challenges and failures and developing kind of maybe more of a mastery orientation or developing resilience and things like that over time. And I think any individual or team sport can have that. And as coaches, this is where we have to be a little bit artistic about it and kind of discuss it in different ways and shape different training and experiences to provide that challenge and keep them learning and thinking. So I guess didn't answer your question directly, but I think some of we need to think about skills and dispositions and how we're developing a whole person and not only kind of the behavioral skills that are learned in one moment.
We haven't looked a lot at that, or I haven't seen a lot of studies on it, but I've thought a lot about it. And first, you might want to do an assessment of your sport. Let's take basketball or volleyball, where there's, in basketball, 5 people take the court. They've got to interact directly to be successful. That's very different than a figure skater going out by himself. It doesn't mean in skating you can't learn about teamwork, but it's probably easier in a basketball type setting or certain elements of communication. Like in basketball we might have or soccer. So we might, I've always thought, golf, you learn a lot about patience. You hit the ball for 2 minutes and spend 3 hours walking around or riding in a cart to get it. Tennis, where there's a lot of mistakes. Wrestling, where it takes really hard effort. To me, we might think about, okay, does my sport give me certain advantages relative to teaching some skills? And at the same time, I just remember a study we did many years ago, not in life skills, but on Olympic swimmers. And one of the stars of the Olympics, a US swimmer, talked about the importance of teamwork. And most people would think, and it wasn't relays. She said, I know if I have a bad swim, my teammates will pick it up for me. So it was sort of a belief in the teammates have your back. So in one hand, I think sports can teach all types of things. But if you're a golf coach, you might have to be a little more intentional if you're bringing teamwork in. Then a basketball coach, you better bring it in or you're going to be terrible type thing.
But that's a great idea, really, in terms of really understanding what kind of affordances your sport gives you, really, to see how you can maximize those, or as you say, create new affordances, new opportunities based on the things that your sport doesn't do particularly well. Okay, perfect. Listen, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Gary because I know there's quite a few questions really in the chat. So let's get to them, Gary.
Yeah, we've had quite a few in. The first comes from Juan, who has actually shared an experience that they've had that they've spent quite some time integrating life skills into planning, which has taken quite a bit of time to catch on in the grassroots and community setting. While Carl addressed this slightly in one of the previous questions, I wonder how else you'd try to promote life skills within either community settings or then in the performance settings.
I can maybe take a first stab, but Dan and Scott, obviously, feel free to jump in at this. So I guess I'll maybe take the angle, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, especially at that sort of like community recreational level, where you may not have a lot of time involvement, or varying levels of sort of engagement or commitment on the part of athletes, parents, etc. I think that provides a real opportunity for me to connect with sort of the outside of sports stuff. They're spending a lot of time outside of sport. So if we can, both make the effort, again, I think we've sort of hit on it from different angles today. Dan mentioned sort of, the needs assessment. I'm talking about sort of, and Scott talked about congruence, and I talked about like asking kids about their lives. So figuring out what else is going on in the kids' lives, because again, there's a lot of time there. And so we just talked about, sort of leveraging what's going on in sport, looking for affordances kind of within the sport context. But for this one, because you may not have sort of the direct pressures to like produce the superstar athlete and bump them up and get them selected to the A team or whatever, I'd say, are there ways you can link maybe with community, with school, with neighborhood, if sort of a geographically neighborhood connected sort of catchment area, however the recruitment process works. So for me, that's sort of where my brain goes right away. And a lot of the positive development life skill stuff, the big one is, trying to help, again, both connect across and sort of the congruence of messages, but also are there ways that we can help kids think about giving back to their communities, right? That it goes beyond just them developing as an individual and shines outward so that they become helpful to other people and transmitting the messages across. And so there might be an opportunity there to really connect with communities and sort of play up that element of things that might be potentially a little bit harder if you're in a, compared to a competitive setting that is kind of like go, rigid all the time there. So I'm not sure how that meshes.
The other thing with a recreational setting, I'm overgeneralizing some, but you usually have less time with the kids. So and you usually have more kids and they're not as engaged. So to me, it's more general coaching. It's similar to if I'm a physical educator with 40 kids in the room. We know from the research, if coaches are positive, encouraging, and on a consistent basis, they do get self-esteem increases in kids in those kind of those settings. But the other thing I'm thinking about more from a programmatic, many years ago when I interviewed for the director of the Institute for the Study of Youth Sports here, I came up and I went to some high school games with Jack Roberts, our director at the time of the High School Association, who was a brilliant guy. And he talked about sportsmanship. I go, well, I've heard this before. It's what you talk about when you don't win. Well, he takes me to a high school game and it wasn't atypical. They had a big theme about sportsmanship. I walked in and there were signs that talked about sportsmanship. At the game, the announcer mentioned sportsmanship. At halftime, it's mentioned. And we were leaving and there's a rug on the floor that had their logo and a sportsmanship tag. So in a way, if from a recreational setting, if there were some things we were really trying to emphasize, if we were in marketing or sales, we'd be advertising and you'd be hearing it. We're in the middle of a political campaign now, and I don't want to see another ad the rest of my life. Every minute I see a political ad. But in a way, that may be how we need to think more general, more programmatic, but also in a good way, repeated messaging to kids in different forms. So hopefully it sinks in, and their parents.
And I think that if I may just butt in there, that's something that we, again, as coaches, we need to learn to be patient, that none of this develops overnight. That I think, Scott, you mentioned it, that you're only going to know if you've been successful 25 years later. And we just have to accept that, and that we just have to, at times we will sound like a broken record, but that's our job. It's like parenting, really, where you just have to repeat things and wish for the best and not be impatient.
Yeah, and I think that really reflects the deliberateness, right, of coaching and integrating that into our planning. Our next question comes from Owen, who's asked a few things, really. He would like to know what settings the most recent findings have come from, and also, have you found any differences across genders, whether that be the types of life skills most important to certain genders, or the ways that those relationships are forged and approaches are employed?
Yeah, so I guess I'll speak to some of the to the first one, and I think we need to continue to do a better job of looking at the different contexts and study different contexts and really understand what's going on. I think there is a lot of good research in kind of life skills specific PYD programming. Kind of one program that comes to mind is the life sports program at Ohio State University, and kind of linking back to that last question, very specific. It serves an underserved community. A lot of Black and African American kids, and one of the main goals of the program is safety, to provide a safe environment for them to play. And then on top of that, they build lectures and kind of little messages around kind of 4 key life skills. Then they bring in parents to reinforce those messages. And there's been a lot of good research to say that's effective and kids at all ages, both boys and girls, but in particular, really connecting those messages to what these young kids need when they're not only in the safe camp environment, but when they go back to their maybe challenging and violent communities even. So kind of the skills are very specific. I think to the gender question, I think, again, we need to do a lot more kind of specific research within that. But there's, again, Girls on the Run and Girls on the Game, a couple of great programs here in the US. And I think the international have some really good messages around kind of just empowering young girls through the sport of running and just giving them the confidence. So kind of some life skills and messages around that. And I think they've found some really positive findings to show it, again, not necessarily around a cognitive behavioral skill, but just empowering and that sense of confidence that you can get from participating in sport. And again, I think some good kind of female specific focus there.
And maybe just quickly add on to that, I totally agree with everything Scott says in terms of the need to continue to diversify our the settings in which we're doing research, and therefore the applicability of our messages across different contexts. Just in terms of the, again, I sort of echo Scott about in terms of gender, that probably not enough research done, but also I think we could pull on, especially some of the, maybe the sociological research that's being done, and just probably help us to be aware sort of the social pressures that young girls and women are exposed to, especially going into adolescence, when we know there's a massive drop off in most sort of Western societies in terms of participation in sport for girls and women, especially sort of, heading into the high school age, or at least what it is here in North America. But again, so those pressures on particularly body image and experience heightened judgments of bodies, that other people are now making judgments on there, and what that means for sort of internalized images of thinking about ourselves and health and understanding bodies, particularly in sport, and pressures to and maybe this is changing now, pressures to show femininity versus sort of engage with the sort of the athletic ethos, so it's sort of the female athlete paradox that often gets talked about in more sociological oriented stuff. So I think sort of being aware of that, being aware of sort of the lived realities and pressures the young girls and women experience, can maybe help us bring a sort of a more sort of sensitive and appropriate and hopefully helpful approach to that. So I don't have any good answers, but if that maybe can be brought more to our awareness, we may be able to make better judgments in the moment.
And I think just to add to that, I think as coaches, the challenge, and really whether we like it or not, we've got to be prepared to discuss some of those issues, working with young female athletes, discussing body image, discussing certainly across the board mental health, and in particular now, I think discussing social justice issues and different things related to that. We've got to have a discussion about that. And those are some of the messages that the kids are wanting to learn, and using sport as kind of a context to be able to take some of those life skills or lessons and then take them to their community. So I think as coaches, the challenge, we've got to embrace that as an opportunity to teach those life skills through sport.
Yeah, kind of tying back to the original question about the gender differences, that hasn't been looked at much at all. But we do have some general findings, like especially if you're working, I think, with recreational athletes. The literature is pretty consistent over the years that boys report to be more confident than girls when it comes to motor skill development. So, and there's still some inequities in terms of how parents play with kids. So if I'm a coach at the rec level, I might feature confidence and belief in one's ability, self-reference goals for both boys and girls, but particularly for girls. The other, at the high school age now for all kids, but I know tied to the body image things, is you want to be talking to your kids about appropriate social media use, because a lot of bullying happens on social media. And did you see Charlotte? Look, she looks, her thunder thighs, they'll use some terrible term. So really getting your kids to talk about social media. And that's also made more complicated now, because as a coach, at least in the US, thanks to Larry Nassar and these terrible monsters, you just can't be tying to kids all the time on social media. But if you can somehow maybe have your captains, if they're older, let you know what's going on. That's a real big one that can really affect kids in a lot of ways, both boys and girls.
Thanks, everyone. I guess one more question, which has come from Mustafa. They're asking, what are your thoughts around life skills transfer from, first of all, sports into non-sport context, and also the opposite, so non-sport context, bringing them to a sporting environment?
I guess, yeah, I'll chime in there. I mean, I think that's a really important consideration, and that's why we kind of added the life skills brought to the conversation, because it's going both ways. Athletes bring life skills to sport that we can either build or enhance, but also we can take life skills and help athletes transfer them or apply them to other contexts. So certainly from a research perspective, we need to be starting to think about looking at it both ways and not just kind of look at it like, okay, sport does these great things and we can help athletes take them and transfer them to other contexts. So 100% agree with Mustafa there. We need to be thinking about both ways and how we can leverage that to enhance sport, enhance performance, but also help athletes kind of enhance performance in other domains.
I think, we haven't looked too much at how the reverse, how they could bring other things, into sport. Again, it depends on your culture. I know in Singapore, it's sort of opposite the US. There's so much pressure for kids academically that sport's kind of secondary. So, and where in the US, we're trying to get kids study more because sport's so important. So, sort of how to bring sort of other things in, like, I actually think it may be even more at the coaching level. Some of the coaches we read, I remember one coach, Scott, and I interviewed, said he was reading something about, like, in his own life, giving to charity. And he thought that he never taught his athletes about giving to charity. So then he put in like a whole thing on what empathy was. And they were at a camp and you'd have a big jar and they'd sell pizza at night or whatever. And he said if the kids put their change in the jar, he would double it. And then he went and got a charity where kids had like cleft palates, where, a face deformity, and these Doctors Without Borders would fix it. And then he showed the pictures before and after the kids and showed what their money did. But he would have never thought about that from just a coaching perspective. He brought it from outside.
I can one because I think this area of understanding what children are exposed to outside sport, so we can maximize the power of that in sport, and the idea of the congruence of both environments working together. I've got into the habit of asking initially my own children, my two boys, how do you deal with these things in school? What kind of things do teachers do? Because teachers do a great job. I mean, there are some teachers that really take it to heart, where they want to go beyond maths or geography, whatever, and they do some brilliant stuff. So I've been learning from my own kids to what's happening in the classroom, and can I replicate that in the basketball court, but also then asking the same things of my players, really. When something like this happens in the classroom, how does the teacher deal with this, or what kind of, and that's really brought a new dimension to some of the things that we do, because again, the children will not only tell you what the teacher does, but how that feels to them, if it works or if it's just a load of BS that they just goes over their head and they don't listen to it. And I think we should do more of that, of trying to see what other people are doing, or other coaches, really, how are they handle this.
I think that's a great point, Sergio, and I'll add to that another example. I think a lot of times we kind of view parents as the enemy, right? I think one strategy that we can use is kind of maybe talking to parents about, okay, how does your child best respond in stressful situations? Kind of how do they respond at home, and what strategies do you use? And then again, teaming up and say, hey, here's a great strategy. Here's a great tool that we can teach this young athlete to deal with stress or deal with pressure, and kind of come at it together and kind of teach it a holistic skill they can use everywhere. Then more likely for it to stick and drive home.
Absolutely. Parents are the biggest resource we have, completely.
I also think there's in what you mentioned there, Sergio, and then Scott, what you highlighted, in general, like both in relation to transfer in and outside of sport, and even within sport, or learning lessons, that like learning from what works is often a really underrated tool. And I think it ties into sort of what Dan said, and Scott said about cueing reflection, things like that. Like if we figure out what works and bring the athletes in and help them figure out what works, then sometimes you can get sort of a snowball effect where the kids start figuring stuff out on their own. right? And making connections to other contexts outside of sport. If we develop that habit, it's sort of like a meta skill. So rather than having to teach all of the individual skills, we can help ourselves and kids think about how we solve problems, think about how we can learn from our experiences. Sometimes that can even go beyond what we directly teach.
And Carl, and I think Gary, we're going to bring it to a close because I don't want to keep these guys any longer. But in that sense, because that really brought me to the last thing I wanted to highlight, really, this idea of the meta skill, that sometimes rather than focusing on the specific skill, what we need to actually is like the rather than giving them a fish, teaching them to fish. Because I've realized really over the last few years, the last 5 years particularly, that pays off big time compared to going to the discrete individual skills. The idea of, well, let's really teach them to be responsible and to drive their own learning, really, and give them time to do that and to make mistakes, like you were saying. Have you found this? I see you were nodding, which is great, but have you found that both in your research and and your practical experiences?
I'll start and then I'll let the others maybe finish off. But for me, that's been a massive part of my research and something that's really caught me as well. I find that fascinating, and I also study sort of child-led play, so outside of like adult-led, coach-led organized sport, and that tends to be some of the bigger findings, both in our own work and general child development stuff. Sometimes kids have a massive capacity if we can sort of
tap into it really and allow them to tap into it really.
Yeah, the learning how to learn is a critical capacity. So I would say yes, absolutely. I think that really helps.
Yeah, one of the things that I've recently learned, it's really kind of opened my eyes. Well, we use the term life skill quite a bit. One weakness of it is it makes it sound like a discrete skill. You know, I learned goal setting, whatever. And in the studies Scott and I are doing, I think I've come up with almost a theory that people develop an experience bank through sport. In fact, one person, and sometimes they can't articulate it. One guy we interviewed who was a president of a company said, we got bought out, I got new bosses. And I'm not quite sure how sport helped me, but when I was a basketball player, I needed to make a critical shot and I got put in stressful situations, and he couldn't put his finger on it, but he said, I was still stressed out, but I negotiated it better. And I know somehow it was because of all those sport experiences. So in addition to specific skills, which at times are really important, like meet and greet skills, etc., I think kids sort of develop dispositions or life worldviews of, like achievement or whatever. And then they travel with them. And sometimes they can't articulate, even as adults, what it was, but they know somehow it helped them. And I know that doesn't give you a lot of things to hang specifics on, but I think what you do as coaches, as not all kids, I mean, we got to be realistic, but you're going to hit some kids. I remember to this day what my high school baseball coach told me and my high school football coach, or how, I was writing about the psychology of excellence. My baseball coach made us wear practice uniforms. We set the bats up a different way. Well, I run a laboratory. I set it up. I want to keep it clean. I see a lot of Coach Curley in what I do running an institute. So let Scott have the last word because he's the Kiwi and he always gets the last word.
I guess, yeah, I just to bring those thoughts together, I think one, there's a really good connection with the idea of transformational coaching, kind of empowering them and building young athletes up. And again, I guess I'll go back to what we were saying about, like, really youth are the agents of their own change, right? They're in charge, they're driving their own development, and we can't hold their hand through their life beyond sport and outside of sport. So that, as you say, Sergio, the more we can empower them and just give them those tools that they can kind of think differently and think about growth outside of sport, I think that's going to be the way forward, rather than, again, being transactional. Say, hey, use this skill and try it out and good luck. It's kind of like, hey, how can you think about growing and developing and continuing to be aware of that growth?
Fantastic, guys. Well, listen, not just a comment just came in on the chat that I was going to say the same thing, that I really like the idea of the experience bank, that we are in the business of creating experiences for these kids that they can put in the bank. And I had a further thought, really, that I think we haven't really paid enough attention to, just to conclude, but the idea that the same experiences are happening to the coach. Coaching also helps you develop life skills. And like you said, Dan, I can see sometimes that I'm running my lab or my team at the university the same way that I run my team. for good or bad. Okay. But I think that's something that we need to consider, and the idea of really buying into the experience and as opposed to the discrete skills, I think is important. So listen, on that note, thanks a million to all three of you. You really are at the cutting edge of this, and you've been at the cutting edge for the last 4 decades. So please continue the great work that you're doing, because it's helping us all. Thanks a million to Gary for all the work behind the scenes to make the webinar happen. And thanks a million to everybody for joining in. Stay safe, stay connected, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.